Good morning and welcome to this hearing in the Sheku Bayo Public Inquiry. I'm going to begin by inviting Senior Counsel to the inquiry to indicate the evidence that will be introduced in this hearing. Ms. Graham.
This hearing is focused on training provided to officers. I intend to call 3 witnesses, commencing with Inspector Young this morning. He will speak to the officer safety training that was being given to officers in the period leading up to May 2015 and how training changed after that. Next week we will hear from Dr. Stevenson, who will be giving evidence about the medical implications of the training given, particularly in connection with topics including positional asphyxia and acute behavioural disorder. Later, in the final week of this hearing, we will hear from Inspector Bradley, who is the current head of operational training for Police Scotland. He will give evidence about the current training programme and work in progress. For this 3-week hearing, the inquiry team have taken a large number of very detailed witness statements from those involved with officer safety training prior to 2015 and at the current time. They cover a wide variety of topics regarding tactical communications and de-escalation, restraint, positional asphyxia, and the training given to officers on handling those suffering from mental health problems, drink and drugs intoxication. Having considered those statements, it is my view that there would be very little benefit to you, the Chair, to hear from these witnesses beyond what is contained within their statements in oral evidence. Their signed witness statements are evidence in themselves and will be available to you for consideration and will be made available to the public on the website in normal course. With that in mind, the approach I have decided to take with this hearing is to focus on a limited number of witnesses where I consider hearing additional oral evidence will assist you in fulfilling your terms of reference, and to rely on the website to provide that more detailed information to the public via the publication of these statements. Next year, we will hear further evidence in relation to training, including from Martin Graves, who will provide expert evidence on the officer safety training programme, diversity training received by officers, and those in the Crown and PERC will also be addressed in later hearings. Finally, we have still to hear from 1 witness to conclude evidence on post-incident management by Police Scotland, and that is Police Sergeant Gordon Miller. I hope to take that evidence during the course of this block of hearings.
Thank you. Can we have the witness in now, please? Good morning, Inspector. Just have a seat. Good morning, Inspector Young. Thank you for returning to the inquiry. May I remind you that you're still subject to the affirmation which you made. Ms. Graham.
Good morning, Inspector Young.
Morning.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
When I was looking at my notes, I realised that it was 1 year ago today that you last gave evidence before the inquiry. So you were very helpful last time and gave a summary of your background. Would you mind if I just briefly recap some of that so everyone knows
Of course.
the position? In 2012, you were working as a police sergeant at Tullyallen doing probationer training.
That's correct.
And then in October 2013, you took over responsibility for officer safety training that was delivered at Tullyallen.
That's correct.
But you were responsible, as I understand it, was that just to probationers or was that to anyone who attended Tullyallen?
At that time, it was only for the probationer training programme at Tullyallen.
Thank you. And then in September 2014, you moved to Jackton and you took over the role of National Officer Safety Coordinator.
That's correct, yes.
And that role covered probationer training, and did it also cover refresher training?
Yes, it did.
So it was both at that time?
At that
from
time, yes.
That stage. And then the date that we've been focusing on in this inquiry has been the 3rd of May 2015. So you were National Officer Safety Coordinator at that time.
That's correct, yes.
And I think you told us when you last gave evidence that you qualified as a first aid instructor in 2015. Is that correct?
Round about that time, I don't remember the exact date or year, but yes, sounds accurate, yes.
Was that before May of 2015 or after?
I couldn't honestly say. I don't know exactly the date.
And then in 2016, in October, you were promoted to the head of Officer Safety Training.
That's correct, yes.
So you were in charge of that entire department, or as if I call it that?
The operational elements, yes. Obviously, I had chief inspectors and superintendents, etc., above me, but my main responsibility was the operational aspect of the programme, yes.
So can you help the chair understand the role of National Officer Safety Coordinator, and then how that differed from being the head of the Officer Safety Training?
Yes. So, as a sergeant, as the Officer Safety Training Coordinator, my primary role was simply about ensuring we had sufficient resources in place to meet the demand of the programme. It was about mainly managing the team. So I really didn't have any input at that time into the content of the programme. As I say, it was coordinating all the refresher courses across the country, making sure we had sufficient resources, sufficient venues to meet the demand placed on the programme.
So initially you had been a trainer at Tullyallen
Yes.
for probationers, then you were coordinating at Tullyallen, and then you became the head of the Officer Safety Training.
Yes.
Thank you. And you continued as head of Officer Safety Training, and at some point you were also given the role of dealing with training in relation to tasers.
That's correct, yes.
And at some point you then left aside your Officer Safety Training role and moved into tasers full time.
That's correct, yes.
And was that March 2022?
It was, yes.
Sorry, March
No,
2020.
2020, yes.
Sorry, my mistake.
Right.
So from March 2020, you left aside the Officer Safety Training parts of your work and focused exclusively on the tasers.
Yes,
And is it tasers you're still working with today?
it is, yes.
Thank you. I see in one of your statements, which is SBPI 00153, paragraph 6. So just to remind you, that is your statement from last year, 21st of March 2022. And I think in paragraph 6 you say that you actually have a number of qualifications in relation to training.
That's correct, yes.
And what it says is I have a higher national diploma in training and development, a Bachelor of Arts in tertiary education, and a teaching qualification in further education.
That's correct, yes.
So are these distinct from your work as in Police Scotland as a trainer? Or are they part of the qualifications that you've obtained during the work that you're doing as a trainer?
They were, the diploma was part of my training role. My degree was supplementary, which I did in my own time and then paid for my own time, yes.
And when did you do your degree?
My goodness, 2017 maybe? I can't remember exactly, sorry.
No, that's absolutely fine. Were you training at that time in Police Scotland?
Yes.
Thank you. Can I move on and ask you about during the time you've been involved in officer safety training, so as a trainer, as a coordinator, as the head of the department, were you aware of concerns being expressed by the Scottish Police Federation at times about the nature of the training that was being given?
I believe prior to myself coming into the role, I think there was a working group prior, and I think it was under the auspice of ACPOS at that time, where concerns had been raised about potentially the disparity of the training that was being delivered across the legacy forces. But personally, I never engaged with the Federation in that respect, no.
And when you say when you came into the role, was that before you became the national coordinator, or was it before you became the head?
It was before I became the coordinator.
Right, thank you. Now, when you gave evidence last year, I asked you about a number of statements, and I'm not going to go through those again today, but for your own use, there are copies in the blue folder in front of you. Now, there were 3 PERC statements from the 14th of September 2015, the 11th of December 2017, and the 12th of January 2018. We went through those last time, but if you wish to refer to them, please let me know. And then you also had given us an inquiry statement last year in advance of giving evidence, and that was from the 21st of March 2022. And again, there's a copy of that in your folder. I might refer to some paragraphs at moments, and we'll bring it up on the screen as we did before. Right. Could you give me a moment?
Of course.
Please. I wonder perhaps if we could very briefly adjourn, as I understand there's a difficulty with the system. Thank you.
Well, I'm sorry about that, Inspector. There was a difficulty with the facility that allows the evidence to be displayed on the screen, but I understand that that is now resolved. Ms. Graham.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I was just about to move on to the statement that you've provided us this year. So this is your second inquiry statement, and it's dated the 12th of July 2023, and it's SBPI 00362. We'll see if we can get that up on the screen. Just like magic. So you'll see, Inspector, as we move down that first page, that you'll see this is a statement from the 12th of July 2023 that you gave to the inquiry team, and it's 30 pages. If we could look at paragraph 74, please, which is the final paragraph. I believe the facts stated in this witness statement are true. I understand that this statement may form part of the evidence before the inquiry and be published on the inquiry's website. And again, as it was last year, you have signed all of the pages of this statement, but on the screen we have your signature redacted.
That's correct.
But on your copy, you have a copy in the blue folder. It's your signature that's on the page. Thank you. And you knew that this would be part of the evidence available for the chair and be put on the website when you signed. Thank you. Now, last year you gave evidence about the OST Manual 2013, and you talked about that being version 2 had come out. And can I just be clear, this, if you said last year it came into force or came out on the 1st of September 2013, at that time you were still a police sergeant training probationers in Tullyallen.
Yes.
It wasn't until the following month, the October, that you became the national coordinator.
Not the national coordinator, the coordinator at Tullyallen.
Sorry, the Tullyallen coordinator. And so at the time this manual came out, you were still actively engaged with training recruits at Tullyallen, were you?
Yes.
You confirmed in your previous evidence that this manual, the 2013 manual, would have been the one that was still in force in May 2015.
That's correct, yes.
And you said in evidence last year that in terms of probationers having access to that manual, the 2013 manual, they were all given a copy when they came for their probationer training.
Yes.
At Tullyallen. Would that have been in advance of their training or on their first day?
On the first day or couple of days, yes.
Thank you. And I think you also said in your evidence it was the core reference document for probationer training of the Officer Safety Training Programme, and as well as all probationers getting access to it and being given a copy, that all the officer safety instructors at Tullyallen and all the officer safety instructions throughout the force areas, were also given copies.
Yes.
And so would you have received a copy when you were a police sergeant dealing with probationer training in September 2013?
Yes.
Thank you. And when you refer to that as being a core reference document, that was then used as the basis from which all the training after the 1st of September 2013 was rolled out to probationers and serving officers who were doing refresher training.
Yes, it was a central reference point for the probationer training programme. Yeah.
Thank you. I'd like to go through some information we have heard or that is available to the chair in relation to some of the officers that were at Hayfield Road on the 3rd of May 2015, but in relation to their training. May I begin with, there were 3 probationers on the 3rd of May 2015 that we've heard from, And they were PC Ashley Tomlinson, PC James McDonough, and PC Kaylee Good. They were all present at Hayfield Road that day. Can we begin with Ashley Tomlinson, please? As I understand it, and what I've done is I've asked for copies of the scope records to be available, hard copies, in your folder, and you should be able to find them. And I'm going to take you through very briefly some information we have. I won't ask for these documents to be put up on the screen, that's not necessary. But if we can begin with PC Ashley Tomlinson, for the benefit of those behind me, this is a scope record, PERC 01203, but I don't need it up on the screen. You'll be familiar with scope records, I would
Yes.
imagine. We understand that he joined Police Scotland, as it was then, on the 30th of September 2013. And I think in the scope record, the very first entry on the table, on which you'll see on page 2, says 30th of September 2013.
Yes.
Thank you. And he gave evidence to this inquiry and said he would have been a probationer until about September 2015. Is that about right?
Yes.
So are officers really probationers for a couple of years?
Roughly around about 2 years, yes.
Thank you. For an officer starting on the 30th of September 2013, as Officer Tomlinson was, he would have received his probationer training on the basis of the 2013 manual.
Yes.
And he also attended officer safety training, refresher training, on the 23rd of November 2014. So that's the 23rd of November 2014. And you'll see there it says OST officer safety training requalification and OST first aid spells requalification. And the date is the 23rd of November 2014. And it appears to have been for 1 day.
That's correct.
We understand that the training he received was under the 2013 manual, and he was actually taught by an Alan Smith, who was another officer who was at Hayfield Road, and also an Alistair Shaw. That information won't appear on the scope records in front of you, will it?
No.
No. You just, if you take that from me at the moment, as the case. For those behind me, the statement from Alistair Shaw is PERC 00501. And he talks about being the trainer for that course, requalification course, and PC Tomlinson was in attendance. Then can we look please at PC James McDonough's scope records. That's, again, I don't need this on the screen, but it's PERC 01243. And I understand that he was a probationer in May 2015 and he'd been in post around 6 months. He joined as a special constable on the 20th of November 2013. He did initial training, and on the 6th of October 2014 he became a full-time constable, a probationer effectively. And you'll see that date, 6th of October 2014, on his scope record there. Do you see that? It's the bottom
Yes, the
entry.
bottom, yeah.
And then he explained he did a special constable conversion course on the 11th of November 2014, based on the 2013 manual. And does that sound like the correct procedure?
Yes, it does.
I see here on his scope record it says OST, Officer Safety Training Requalification from the 11th of November 2014. And we understand PC McDonough viewed that as a special constable conversion course. Is there anything that is unusual about listing it on his scope record as effectively a requalification or a refresher training?
No, because he would have had received his initial training
Right.
as a special constable, and then it's a requalification.
So can you tell us, the initial training for a special constable, is that markedly different from the initial training as a probationer?
I can't comment on what it was like before I came in to post, but certainly from when I was in post, it was the exact same. So a special constable received the exact same officer safety training initial course as full-time officers.
Thank you. And again, just to be clear, PC McDonough would have been trained on the basis of the 2013 manual.
Yes.
Thank you. And then PC Kaylee Good, again, for the benefit of those behind me, it's a scope record PERC 01202. And PC Good gave evidence that she joined the police on the 5th of January 2015. And she had OST training between the 2nd of February 2015 and the 6th of February 2015. So if we look at her scope record, we can see that she appears to have had some sort of values and ethics briefing on the 6th of January 2015. And I didn't see any particular reference to initial training on that day on this scope record. She does, however, have OST Officer Safety Training Initial listed as 2nd of February 2015 to 6th of February 2015. So would that have been her initial training in the February?
Yes.
So it's not the case that an officer can start with the police on day one and immediately go into training. They can have a slight lag, can they?
Sorry, in what respect?
Right. We hear that she joined in the January,
Yes.
but the initial training on the scope record seems to have been in the February,
Yes.
whereas other officers appear to have started and gone straight into initial training. Is that unusual or
Is
different?
it initial
to anyone?
OST training you're referring to?
That's what it says
Yeah.
here.
Yes.
Initial OST training, 6th of February, 2nd of February to 6th of February 2015.
So there wasn't a set time when officers would receive their initial training during, or initial OST training during their initial training period at Tullyallen. It would very much depend on how many other courses were in, venue availability. So some courses would may wait to week 4 or 5 to get their OST training. Other courses would get it sooner than that, sometimes later.
But it would be the same training course.
Exactly the same training, yes.
And for PC Good, it would have been on the 2013 manual. She has had the training in February 2015.
Yes, it would be, yes.
And there was nothing unusual about the fact she started in the January but didn't get training until the February.
No, it was common.
Quite common.
Yeah.
Thank you. And we've also heard from PC Good that her first shift was in the April, and she was a probationer, and Constable Smith was her, Alan Smith was her tutor constable, mentor. Is mentor a reasonable phrase or word to use?
Tutor, mentor, yes, you could use it.
And is that quite common to be coupled with a tutor mentor?
Yes.
Thank you. And we have a statement from a David Agnew. Did you know David Agnew?
Yes.
Was he also one of the trainers?
He was one of the civilian physical education instructors and one of the lead OST instructors at Tullyallen.
Can you explain to the chair what's the difference between a trainer who's delivering training to probationers or refreshers and a civilian physical education instructor?
So the civilian educational instructors are not police officers. They primarily, their role is the physical education, drill and officer safety training. And they receive training to allow them to deliver that training to probationers.
How many trainers are usually conducting each initial probationer course?
It depends on the size of the course. You'll have a lead instructor, and then depending on the size of the course, it could be 5 or 6 instructors normally.
Will there be usually a mixture, would have there been at that time, a mixture between police officers and civilians, or would it just depend on
No,
availability?
there would usually be the mix of police officers and civilians, because the civilian instructors, one of their primary role was delivery of OST, so normally they would be present during all OST training.
And was there any difference between being trained on the 2013 manual by a police officer compared to a civilian PE
Not in my
instructor?
view, no.
And they'd both received the same training, had they, to deliver that training
Yes.
to probationers? And tell us, in terms of training and the trainers or the civilians, were they all working from the 2013 manual at that time in 2015?
Yes.
So for the chair, when he comes to consider matters, is it fair for him to take the approach that Tomlinson, McDonough and Good, who were all probationers in 2015, had received copies of the 2013 manual, had been trained in relation to the 2013 manual with initial training, and if they had had refresher training, that would also have been on the back of the 2013 manual?
For the initial element, it's fair to say that. For the refresher element, unfortunately, there was no way of telling what training they actually received, because it was back at force. And as I outlined in my review and my previous evidence, there was that disparity across, so it was very difficult to ascertain exactly what training they would have received back at force for the refresher.
So at that time in 2015, you wouldn't have personally been delivering refresher training to anybody at that stage?
In 2015, I was, because I'd moved down to Jackton in 2015. But my time at Tullyallen, I only would deliver refresher training to the Tullyallen staff who required refresher training.
Thank you. I'd like to move away from the probationers who were present at Hayfield Road and turn to Alan Smith, who was an officer in attendance. Again, you have his scope records, hard copy in front of you. For those behind me, it's PERC 01205. I understand he joined Fife Constabulary on the 30th of August 2004. And can you see that he was given his he was receiving training in 2004, and he has a probationer post-initial course and an induction course. Those dates are 20th of December to the 24th of December 2004. He'd also had an induction course in the August to September of 2004. He has given evidence to the inquiry and said he was one of the officer safety trainers. Do you remember Alan Smith?
I don't know.
No. And he said he'd also gone through additional training and previously been an authorised firearms officer, although he'd stopped that role prior to the 3rd of May 2015. My understanding is that for officers who wish to be firearms officers, they have additional training on top of what would normally be given to a constable or someone in a response team.
That's correct, yeah.
Have you ever been involved in that sort of training, firearms officer?
I was a
training?
firearms officer, but I wasn't a firearms instructor, so I received the training, not delivered it.
Thank you. And he gave evidence that he was personally delivering refresher training to officers about 2 or 3 times a month at around the time of May 2015. Would that be quite common for trainers to be giving training 2 or 3 times a month, or does it vary?
It would vary. At that time, we had I suppose, well, apart from Legacy Strathclyde Police, all the other forces, it was a part-time model. So the officers would work on a response shift or at a division, and would be drafted in to deliver OST refresher training as and when it was required.
And we know that he was he was drafted into Fife Constabulary, so that would have been with a part-time training regime in place.
Yes.
Thank you. He described himself as, in evidence, as having a good working knowledge of all the OST source techniques and training. And is that what you would expect from someone who was trained to be a trainer?
Yes.
Thank you. And for someone like Alan Smith, who's a trainer, if he's doing any training after the 1st of September 2013, would that have been on the basis of the 2013 manual?
It should be.
And I think from what you said earlier, in September 2013, all trainers were given a copy of the manual.
As far as I was aware, yes.
Now, Smith was given training to become a trainer by David Agnew. And again, for the benefit of those behind me, that's PERC 00503. And on page 7 of his PERC statement, David Agnew mentions Smith at the top of page 7. Sorry, no, PERC 00503. Let's just have that on the screen for a moment. So, and we'll look at page 7. And I think it's at the top of the page he mentions Smith. There we are. If we can go back to the previous page and just read. So he said, this is the statement of David Agnew. I have been asked by investigators if I was the instructor on the Officer Safety Training Instructor course at Tullyallen on the 2nd of December 2013 to the 13th of December 2013. I can confirm that I was the instructor on this course. I have checked the OST instructor assessment system and have confirmed this information. This system is maintained solely at the Police College by staff on campus here. I can confirm the location of this course is the Scottish Police College. I think it was redacted who instructed this course alongside myself. I've been asked by the investigators if I have any memory of who was on this particular course. Due to the passage of time, I do not. However, I have been asked if I have any personal knowledge of PC Alan Smith. I do not know this individual. However, I have provided the investigators with the OST Instructors course registration form for PC Alan Smith, and that's the module course registration form. And the document details the above named individual was present on this course. And I can confirm he successfully passed this course. And the course was taught as per the content discussed previously in the manual. And he previously in his statement, he talks about the 2013 manual. And so for someone who has been given this instructor's course and who's successfully passed the course, would you, in relation to the 2013 manual, would you expect them to have a reasonably good working knowledge of the techniques and the content of that manual?
Yes.
Can I move on now to other officers who were at Hayfield Road who were not probationers, they were not qualified trainers or instructors, but they had more years of service? If we could look, first of all, in relation to some of the scope records, let's look at the scope record for Alan Payton. Again, I won't ask for this to be up on the screen, but you can look at the hard copy. And this is PERC 01207 for those behind me. Now, I understand that he joined Fife Constabulary also, and that was on the 13th of September 2001. And we can see that he had an induction course on the 13th of September 2001 from his scope records that lasted till the 21st of September. And then he's listed as having officer safety training from the 14th of September to the 21st of September 2001. Do you see that on the scope records? And so he had around 14 years service by 2015. And then if we can look briefly at the scope records for Craig Walker, again without putting it on the screen, it's PERC 01206. You can look at the hard copy. Walker was another officer who joined Fife Constabulary, and he joined on the 30th of August 2004. And you'll see at the bottom of his scope record of the table, it says that he had police staff induction course, data protection training and probationer post-initial course, and then officer safety training. And he seems to have begun his probationer period with some training which involved officer safety training and an initial probationer course. Do you see that?
I see that, yes.
And is that, that would be a while ago, that was 10 years prior to May 2015. But again, it appears even at that time, probationers were being given training courses, although not under the 2013 manual, obviously. Could we turn to the scope records for Maxwell? PERC 01201, we won't put that up on the screen. He is another officer who also joined Fife Constabulary, and that was on the 21st of July 2008. So he had 7 years service in 2015. And again, it would appear that he commenced his probationer period with an induction course, and there's references there on that table to a number of different courses that he was given at that time when he arrived.
Yeah.
And then Short, PC Nicole Short, not on the screen, PERC 01200, scope record. She joined Fife Constabulary on the 20th of July 2009. She had 6 years service in 2015. Do you see that?
Yes.
And again, it would appear she began her probationary period with Fife Constabulary by being given an induction course and other probationer courses. And then Gibson, scope record, PERC 01204. Joined Fife Constabulary again on the 20th of February 2012. Had 3 years of service by 2015 and was no longer a probationer at that time. And again, we can see the induction course and the training that was given when PC Gibson joined Fife Constabulary. So all of these officers with more service who were no longer probationers, they were all part of Fife Constabulary. That's one of the legacy forces that we've heard about.
Yes.
Before Police Scotland came into existence on the 1st of April 2013.
Yes.
So I had to think about that date there. Now, for Gibson, I understand that he had 3 years service in 2015, but wouldn't have received training under the 2013 manual. Neither would any of those officers. None of them would have been trained because they all joined before 2013.
So they wouldn't have received the training as per the 2013 manual.
So they would have received training under different manuals and different materials prior to the creation of the 2013 manual.
That's correct, yes.
And I understand that there may be some issues in recovering manuals and materials prior to, or for those officers in relation to them.
Yes.
But for all of those officers, they would all have had refresher training on an annual basis.
Yes.
And that would have continued presumably throughout their service.
That's correct, yes.
And from the 1st of September 2013, you mentioned earlier that they should have been trained on the 2013 manual for each of their refresher training courses, but you weren't in a position to confirm that personally.
I mean, I don't know what I don't recall any national decision being made that they must be refreshed in that manual back at force. I made that decision later on, but I don't know. So I don't recall any, I suppose, direction, memo, etc., coming out saying that they will have, you must only be trained, or the training must only be delivered from this manual.
Right. When did you issue the direction that everyone should be trained under the 2013 manual?
I think it would be round about 2015. There was an email I put out to all officer safety instructors across the country to say that the only techniques that should be delivered is from the 2013 manual. I think it was around about 2015.
Do you remember when in 2015 you
No.
issued that instruction?
I'm sorry, no.
Can you help me, was it before May or was it after May 2015?
I couldn't honestly say, but I mean, it may even be 2014. I don't know. I really don't know.
No, that's fine. So you issued the instruction at some point,
Yeah.
2015 or maybe 2014, for trainers who had received a copy of the 2013 manual from September 2013 when it came in. Was there anything stopping them using that manual, the up-to-date manual, to deliver training?
To use a 2013 manual? No.
Yes, no. Do you know of any reason why they wouldn't be using that manual, particularly in Fife?
I couldn't refer directly to Fife. There was a general consensus that there was many instructors, divisional instructors, who didn't agree with the techniques that were in the 2013 manual. There was, from speaking to a number of instructors, they preferred their own techniques that they had maybe been taught previously. There was a number of barriers. One of the barriers, I think, as well, from feedback, was that it came from the central, it came from the college, and they would prefer, they preferred their own techniques, their own way of training. So that was a number of the challenges that we faced back then, to have parity across the country with regards to refresher training.
I think you spoke about that when you gave evidence last time.
Yes.
And do you remember if there were any particular regions or legacy forces that were resisting the move to the 2013 manual?
There was, we had instructors from probably from most of the divisions who weren't particularly happy that we had to refer only to 2000 manual. I wouldn't be able to comment on whether there was more from one area or from another. I know there was some from the west area, there was some from the east area, and from the north as well. So I don't think there was any particularly area that I would say where it was particularly challenging in respect of not wanting to comply with what was in the 2013 manual.
Right, thank you. Can I check with you that up until May 2015, there was 1 day of annual refresher training given to officers?
Yes.
That's been changed now. I think it's now 2 days.
It's now 2 days annually, yes.
Do you remember when it changed?
To 2 days.
To 2 days.
My goodness, I think it was just prior to COVID, so maybe around about 2020-ish,
Right.
or round about there.
I think we went into lockdown in March 2020, so
Yeah. Maybe in 2019, but I think it was 2020, round about there.
all right, thank you. And I'd like to ask some questions about the refresher training that officers would have had sort of prior to the 3rd of May 2015, so the most recent refresher training they had. We understand that Walker had refresher training on the 5th of November 2014.
Okay.
And that's from the scope records as well. And that included OST, officer safety training, and first aid, which I think was called SPELLS.
Yes.
And so that was 6 months prior to the incident in May 2015. And Maxwell had that training, that refresher training, on the 6th of November 2014. So again, about 6 months prior. Alan Payton had refresher training on the 4th of January 2015. Again, OST and first aid, around 4 months prior to the incident in May. Nicole Short had refresher training on the 25th of February 2015, 3 months prior, and PC Gibson had refresher training on the 4th of March 2015. So within a period of roughly 6 months prior to the incident, all of those officers that I've named, Walker, Maxwell, Payton, Short and Gibson, had had a day's refresher training. And at that time, the manual in place was the 2013 manual. At the refresher training prior to May 2015, if they were receiving training in relation to changes that appeared in the 2013 manual, would trainers be drawing their attention to changes, modifications, significant matters that had altered, or are you not able to help me on that?
I wouldn't be able to say. It would very much down to the individual instructor on the day.
Right. All right. You said that probationers would have been given the manual in 2013. What access would refresher training people have? Students of can I call them refreshers? Is that?
Yeah, refreshers, yes.
Yes. What access would the refreshers have to the 2013 manual prior to May 2015?
Unless there was hard copies available, then I would probably say very little, if any at all.
Right. If they wanted to have access to that manual, how would they get a copy or get access to
It
it?
would depend on the individual division or legacy force, whether they had placed the manual on their divisional intranet site. I don't think it was available. I don't think it was available through the national intranet site. So if if an officer at division wished access to the manual, they would. Again, I can't say with any degree of certainty, but they would probably have to request that manual in a hard copy from their local OST instructors.
Is that the position now, that people have to
No.
seek out? No. What do you do now?
It's on the operational safety training intranet landing page.
So for a refresher now, they can access it through the internet if
Yes.
they wish to see it.
That's correct, yes.
Is anyone given hard copies now?
I wouldn't be able to say. I haven't been involved in OST for a number of years now, so I don't know.
Sorry. Do you know, prior to 2015, May 2015 in particular, was there any expectation on the part of people doing refresher training to access the manual, either in advance to look at it or refresh their memory, or print off copies or anything along those lines?
Again, I can't say for certain, but I would doubt it very much.
I'd like to ask you some questions about other statements that we've got about refresher training that was given to the officers. I appreciate that you weren't personally delivering that, but I'd like to ask you about whether the descriptions accord with what you would have expected in your role at that time. Because in May 2015 you were the coordinator.
Yes.
Let's look first of all at PC Walker, Craig Walker. So we've heard that he had refresher training on the 5th of November 2014, 6 months before the incident that we're looking at. And there is evidence available to the chair from an Alistair Shaw. Do you remember Alistair Shaw? He was an instructor.
No, I can't say I do.
And let's look at his inquiry statement, please. SBPI 00156. And this is his signed inquiry statement that's available to the chair. He's given a description of some of the training that he was delivering at that time. So you'll see the statement there, Alistair Shaw, taken on the 23rd of February last year. And I'd like to look first of all at paragraph 9, please. And he says here, as part of the recertification training, we used a training checklist. I've had sight of a training checklist. I can't say whether this was the version in use in 2014-2015. However, it covers positional asphyxia, excited delirium, and also restraint and knife defence techniques, all of which I would expect in a training checklist. So can I ask you, is that something that instructors were using in 2014 and 2015, a training checklist? Would you like to see the one
Yes,
that you
please, if
refer
that's
to?
okay, thank you.
Of course, absolutely. So we see that it's footnoted number 2, and maybe we can get that checklist on the screen. Well, we can come back to that.
Of course.
But in general, would it accord with your recollection at that time, you were coordinator, that a training checklist would cover positional asphyxia, excited delirium, and restraint and knife defence techniques, and that would be for refresher training?
Yes, we provided a checklist that would cover all the techniques that had to be taught during that day, and it was just an easy pro forma guide for the instructors to work their way through.
And was that something that all the instructors were provided with to work through?
I can't say then. I know we updated it and I sent it out with an instruction that it should be used, or it must be used. Whether it was getting used then, because, I mean, to remember, I became the coordinator, the national coordinator, kind of late 2014, early 2015. Mm-hmm. So I can't exactly recall when I would send out these instructions. But I know that some forces prior to me coming into post would use a checklist, others didn't. Some instructors would use one, others wouldn't.
Right. Certainly, it would appear that Alistair Shaw, who gave refresher training to PC Walker in November 2014 has looked at a training checklist that he was using.
And that's the best practice at the time, yes.
So that was best practice.
Yes.
It's certainly a practice that Shaw appears, says
Yes.
certainly in his statement, to
Yep.
be using. So there may have been instructors who were not using best practice, but certainly from what Alistair Shaw's saying, that is best practice.
It would appear to be, yes.
Thank you. And can we look please at paragraph 13 of his inquiry statement? Positional asphyxia. Now again, this is what Alistair Shaw is saying. Generally, training of takedowns normally involved bringing a subject down into the prone position. When we were teaching about takedowns to the prone position, we would pretty much always stress the risks of things like positional asphyxia, making sure that we weren't keeping that person in the prone position for any length of time. They were always getting them up and away from that position as quickly as possible. I like to think that certainly whenever I was teaching, I would always reinforce that message. So when you look at that check sheet, you probably see a small bit there on positional asphyxia, and someone may think, well, they don't talk about that very much, but we would talk about that for every technique that involves somebody coming down into the prone position. We would remind them of the dangers of positional asphyxia, and if you were bringing somebody out there to try and alleviate the pressures of that. Now, from that description, from Shaw, who was an instructor, does that accord with your recollection of what people were teaching at
That's
that
what
time?
should be. That's what should be getting taught. Yes.
So again, that's what should have been.
Yes.
That's the approach that should have been taken.
That's correct. Yes.
Right. Can we look at 14, please? And Alistair Shaw says, we taught students to be aware of the signs of positional asphyxia. We would remind them that just because somebody can speak and shout, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're able to breathe properly. I would remind them that although someone's able to get air out of their lungs, they might not necessarily be able to get air back into their lungs at the same rate. And if we can move down, please. Just because they're shouting or verbalising, I can't breathe, doesn't mean that they're breathing properly. That person may be struggling to breathe. We would get them to look out for behavioural changes. For example, if we have a custody who has been fighting with us and all of a sudden stops fighting and goes limp, then we need to make sure that they're breathing properly. Excuse me. Conversely, if we've got somebody who's really starting to struggle and fight, is the reason for that because they are literally fighting for their lives? Are they struggling to breathe? So to be mindful of that. We would train students to look out for the physical symptoms, such as cyanosis of extremities, including lips and fingertips. If they're starting to go a blue or purple colour, that could be a sign that the person's not getting enough oxygen, to listen out for any sort of gurgling or rasping sounds coming from that person. So these were the things that we were asking students to be aware of. Sorry, my voice is going slightly. So again, reading that description from Alistair Shaw about the type of training that he was delivering, does that accord with your recollection of what should have been taught?
Absolutely. Yes.
Yes, thank you. And then can we look at the paragraph 16, please? We would always make sure that we were teaching students to be mindful of where they were putting their body weight and their hands. Some of the techniques that we did involved, for example, a knee going onto a custody's shoulder for some of our ground pin techniques. When we were teaching that, we would teach students that the knee should be on the shoulder, and we would point out that it shouldn't be on the head, shouldn't be on the neck, shouldn't be on the back or anything like that. It should always be on the shoulder that we were putting that pressure. I'm interested in his description here. Does that accord with what your understanding of the training at that time should have been?
Yes.
Was that good practice?
That's best practice. Yes.
So he says we would always make sure that we were teaching students to be mindful of where they were putting their body weight and their hands. Can you help the chair understand a little bit more about what was behind that training and that instruction to participants on a refresher course?
Yes, so I'm assuming he's talking about prone restraint here.
He certainly referred
Yeah.
to prone restraint
Yeah.
earlier in paragraph 13,
Yes.
I think it was.
So when we taught prone restraint, we would always teach the students where the danger areas were, if you wish to call them that. So that's normally in the centre of the back, down the spine, anywhere that would put direct pressure onto the chest cavity or the lungs or the diaphragm. So to try and mitigate that, we always taught that any pressure to restrain someone in the prone should be through the shoulder blade area or the shoulders. So be mindful of if they're using their hand to facilitate that restraint, then best practice and wherever possible, then it would be through the shoulders. That's still so, and if it was using the knees, then it would be through the shoulders, and that still allows that person to be restrained, but also allows the chest cavity, the diaphragm, etc. to move.
And so if it's focused on the shoulders, is that avoiding the back and the spine completely?
Yes. If possible, yes.
If possible. Now, this reference here to telling students to be mindful of where they're putting their body weight, can you explain a little bit more about why that was being taught?
So, I suppose in a violent struggle, it's not always possible to be extremely accurate where you are pinning someone or where you are when you are trying to prone restrain. And we had seen in the past many times where officers would just simply lie over the back of a subject. For whatever reason, that was obviously their own reasons. So that's why we always, I suppose, contraindicated that wherever possible. That where possible, try not to use the officer's own body weight across, I suppose, the back or the chest area of an individual because of the potential implications of that.
And what were the potential implications of that?
So when you place pressure through the back, especially the weight particularly of a person, then that minimises or at times will stop the chest being able to expand, the diaphragm being able to push up, and obviously that then has that negative impact on that person's ability to breathe, and because of that, the chemical build-up that occurs. So it's simply about trying to ensure that person has as little pressure on the chest area as possible.
And you've talked about pressure, you've talked about body weight. To what extent are they the same thing or different when you're talking about avoiding pressure or avoiding body weight?
So body weight can obviously be placed in a number of different ways. It can be placed by simply relying across that person, so your upper body's on top of their upper body. It can be through knees, so your weight's going down through your knee. So it's just the weight of that officer or that person.
Is that the equivalent of what you say is pressure, applying pressure?
Yes.
And you said you'd seen, was that examples of officers lying on the back of someone who was prone?
Many times.
Many times. When was that? Can you help the chair understand?
Since ever I started in the police, it wasn't uncommon.
Really? When did you start with the police?
1995.
Right.
It wasn't particularly uncommon to see officers lying across violent individuals, because at times that's potentially the only way that they can protect themselves and others.
Right. And so this training, which was being given, for example, this is Alistair Shaw's statement, and you've agreed was part of the training at the time. So that would have encouraged or advised officers to be mindful of putting their body weight.
Absolutely.
And when the word there is used of being mindful, what does that actually mean?
I mean, I don't know in what context this officer's using it. I would obviously, for me it's contraindicated. Wherever you can, you don't do it.
Right.
So it's about ensuring where you can that you don't put pressure on the areas that may cause, severe medical implications.
Right. If you were doing it, was there any guidance at that time for refresher training on how long you should do it or how quickly you should get off or anything like that?
As soon as safe.
And what does that actually mean?
As soon as the threat and the risk from that person is mitigated.
Mitigated, not avoided completely.
I would say not avoided completely, I would say mitigated.
We've heard other evidence last year from a Joanne Caffrey who said there's always the option if she had seen, I'm summarising here, I don't have the exact quotes, but she had seen situations where a lot of officers were trying to restrain someone but they were so strong they couldn't restrain the person. And it was always an option to remove themselves and consider a different option. I mean, that might be sprays or it might be containing the subject, but you could withdraw, I think was the word, or disengage. Was that something that was being taught in terms of sort of refresher training?
Yes. So as part of the training, if you attempted or precluded physical restraint, then the training was that you should disengage and consider other tactical options.
Thank you. Let's move on to paragraph 17, please. Again, sticking with Shaw's statement. I'm asked whether lying across the subject would be an inappropriate or risky form of restraint. Where an officer was lying over the back or the neck and the head, yes. For some techniques, we would lie across the legs. For example, if we were applying fast straps, we would lie across the legs to secure them. So if you've somebody prone on the ground, we wouldn't want the officer coming up above the leg line when you're doing the restraint. One officer would lie across the legs to secure the legs, and a second officer would come in and apply those fast straps in theory. So again, just looking at this for the moment, from what you've just said a moment ago, Inspector, Alistair Shaw is asked whether lying across the subject would be an inappropriate or risky form of restraint. He appears to agree if an officer was lying over the back or the neck or the head. And that sounds like what you would agree with that from what you've just said.
There's an element of risk, absolutely.
And then, can I ask you a little more about the lying across the legs? We've heard evidence that officers were lying, at least one officer was lying across the legs on the 3rd of May. And when he says we wouldn't want the officer coming up above the leg line, what does that actually mean?
So you wouldn't, wherever possible, and if you can be avoided, you don't want the officer who is trying to control the legs going any higher than the top of the legs.
Right. Is that before they reach your waist or your bottom or any of that, or is it?
Yeah, and it's for two reasons. The higher up the legs you are, so if you do go into the area of the bottom or even the lower back, then that subject is still able to engage their legs. And the second reason is obviously the higher up the body you go, then the closer you are to the chest cavity, the closer you are to the diaphragm, and the closer you are to potentially interfering with the breathing mechanism.
So again, these things were taught to refreshers at this time. Can we move on to paragraph 18, please? And this is a paragraph headed Subjects under the Influence of Substances or Excited Delirium. Now, we've heard a lot of evidence about excited delirium. But can I ask you, this is from Shaw, who was teaching refresher training in November 2014. I'm asked what was taught to students in 2014-15 regarding the restraint of subjects who were under the influence of drugs and alcohol. I think at that 2014 time period, we would refer to things like excited delirium. So that is a phrase that we use for custodies we may encounter who were perhaps under the influence of drink or drugs. We reminded students that it may not be that they're behaving in that way because of drink or drugs, that it may be a medical condition or mental health implications that's causing that person to behave that way. So we would always ask students not to assume that somebody is behaving in a particular way due to intoxication, as there may be another cause. And so this is what Alistair Shaw says he was training at the time. Does that accord with your understanding of what should have been trained?
Yes,
In terms of the 2013 manual?
that's correct, yes.
And can I ask, was a distinction made about people who were under the influence of drugs or alcohol and people who were suffering from mental health problems?
If we're specifically referring to excited delirium, then one of the list of possible causes of someone to behave in that way can be either drink or drugs or acute mental health crisis. So it was more about the signs and the symptoms that they were exhibiting and the safe managing, more about the cause. Because if we teach causes, then we have, people look for solutions for that specific cause. So it's not for us to determine what the cause of that is. It's for us to safely manage as much as we can, as best as possible, the signs and symptoms of that behaviour.
We've heard people give evidence saying that it wouldn't be fair to expect officers to be able to diagnose a medical condition or the cause of behaviour.
Exactly.
So there's no suggestion there that you were distinguishing between intoxication for some reason being the fault of a person and mental health not being their fault. That wasn't the distinction that was being drawn.
It shouldn't be, no. It's about the signs and the symptoms that they're exhibiting and the safe management of those signs and symptoms.
Right, thank you. Can we look at paragraph 19, please? Again, just sticking with Shaw's statement for the moment. He says, we would teach students to identify signs of excited delirium. This would include a person is behaving in an unusual manner, if they're not responding to verbal commands, they're not listening to what you're saying, if there's behavioural changes, including having unusual strength. Also, if they're hot to the touch, if they're sweating profusely, or if they're not responding to pain. For example, if they were to baton somebody and they didn't respond to that, and it almost seemed they weren't flinching, that could be a sign that that person was experiencing excited delirium. That could be one of the effects of that. Failing to react to CS spray may be another sign. Someone that is experiencing excited delirium, the effects of CS might be minimal or none at all. And again, from your recollection, in 2014, was that the sort of information that was being shared with refresher students?
The information's correct. And again, and I keep going, but sorry, but whether it was being, whether information was being provided during every refresher course, I couldn't say.
So Alistair Shaw, whose statement this is, was the instructor in November 2014 when PC Walker was given his refresher training. So he was asked in his statement to give an explanation and a description of the training he was giving the students at that time. So if that's his evidence, he signed that statement. If that is what he was doing, would that accord with your understanding of what ought to have been taught under the 2013 manual?
Yes.
Thank you. Could we look at paragraph 22 now, please? And it says, for both excited delirium and positional asphyxia, if officers suspected either was happening, that they should treat it as a medical emergency and get an ambulance out as quickly as possible. Or even if the person is already in the back of the van, for example, take them straight to the A&E department if that's going to be quicker. We would tell them never bring somebody that's showing those signs and symptoms into police custody, because all that would happen is the police custody staff would hopefully identify it and tell them to take them straight up to the hospital. So we would always enforce it has to be treated as a medical emergency. And again, if Alistair Shaw was delivering that training, would that accord with what your understanding is it should have been?
Yes.
And then finally on this statement, I'm appreciative of the time, but I might have time just to complete this. Paragraph 23. People who are under the influence of drugs and alcohol or suffering a drug-induced psychosis, we would treat these people in the same way that we would be treating people with excited delirium, regardless of whether there was a known cause or not. Excited delirium training covered dealing with people who were heavily intoxicated with drink or drugs and maybe experiencing some sort of psychological hallucinations. It would also cover people who've even had a medical emergency like a head injury or some sort of diabetic emergency perhaps that might cause it. It was umbrella training, except we needed to cover all these sort of scenarios that you might encounter as a police officer and how you would deal with them. It wasn't a specific thing to deal with somebody who's on drugs and someone who has a head injury. We would outline the signs and symptoms we would look for and how to alleviate them, and we would cover this under an excited delirium bracket. And if we can go back up to the page so you can see that on the screen. First of all, do you agree with Alistair Shaw where he says people who were under the influence of drugs and alcohol or suffering a drug-induced psychosis, we would treat these people in the same way we'd be treating people with excited delirium, regardless of whether there was a known cause or not? Do you agree with that?
Partly. Again, we try to stay away from specific causes, because, and certainly in my experience, officers would get too caught up in what was the actual cause of the behaviour. And unless you have specific information that it's maybe a medical emergency or that person is has got some sort of condition that would be causing that, I think this is too specific. And he's right in the respect that it is an umbrella term. But whilst I think in the manual it does list some of the potential or possible causes of someone behaving in that manner, then for me, I think this is too specific. This is not how I trained it, get into specifics like that, but it's in line generally.
And he says it wasn't a specific thing to deal with someone who is on drugs or somebody who has a head injury. And if we can go down to the next page. So in this paragraph, he said we would outline the signs and symptoms we'd look for and how to alleviate them. Do you agree with that sentence?
Yes, that's about what behaviour the person is exhibiting, and how you manage that behaviour safely, or as safe as you can.
So in the training that was being given to refreshers, there wasn't any expectation put on the officers that they should diagnose the cause of the behaviour.
No.
Whatever the behaviour was they could see, they would manage it the same way. Is that fair?
That's fair, yes.
Thank you. I'm conscious of the time. I wonder if that might be...
We will take a 20-minute break at this point.
Thank you.
Yes, Ms Graham.
When I started looking at Alistair Shaw's inquiry statement, I referred you initially to paragraph 9. So that's SPPI 00156. And there was a reference to a training checklist for the recertification or the refresher training. Let me just remind you what it said. Paragraph 9. As part of the recertification training, we used a training checklist. I've had sight of a training checklist, and you said you'd quite like to see it. So we provided you in the break with a hard copy, and we can get that up on the screen, PS 11096. And we see here it says Officer Safety Training, OST Record of Training, Annual Requalification Course. So this is the training checklist for refresher training.
That's correct.
And is requalification effectively the same as refresher
Yes.
training? And we can see a list, a table with detailed items listed. So let's quickly look through that. There's the date, the venue, the instructor names, and the instructor's initials. And on this occasion it says LISOSO. And there's the safety briefing, spells, cordons, warm-up, then tactical positioning. And I see their contact and cover, and I will be coming on to that later when I ask you questions about the manual. And then we've got other things like blocks, strikes, holds, search procedure. Down at the bottom on the left-hand side, it talks about fast straps, application, and that's the leg straps or the leg restraints that we've been talking about.
Yes.
And you talked about officer maybe being over the legs of a subject.
Yes.
And then on the right-hand column, we also see references to training on into handcuffing, holds and restraints, and that's at the top on the right-hand column of that page. Handcuffing, holds and restraints, ground defence, breakaways, and then at the bottom on the right-hand column, it talks about CS and PAVA. We've heard evidence that in 2015 there was a transition from CS over to PAVA spray.
That's correct.
So we've heard that some officers had CS and one officer had a PAVA spray already.
That's correct.
Is that right? And so there was training in both sprays at refresher training.
Yes, because there's subtle differences between the two, but yes.
Thank you. And then on to the next page, we see fast straps are continued, baton techniques, arm locks are mentioned, CS PAVA is continued, baton blocks, and then miscellaneous awareness inputs. And here we see excited delirium is the number 1. And we also see PERC awareness and stop and search guidelines are also mentioned. And when it says miscellaneous awareness inputs, what is the distinction between this and the actual techniques or physical acts that are being taught?
So for the awareness inputs, these are areas of the curriculum that can't actually be physically practiced. So we can only give an awareness of them.
For that awareness inputs, prior to May 2015, were there any videos or demonstrations given, or visual methods of communicating the information to the recruits or the refreshers?
Sorry, are you referring to out with the actual one-day recertification day? Or?
No, I'm talking about this is a form that is a checklist for refresher training.
Yes.
And Shaw had said in his statement he used it.
Yes.
And looked one out for us. And I'm wondering, with that training that's given on this checklist for awareness inputs, for example, excited delirium, were there any demonstrations or videos incorporated into that awareness training?
No.
Not at that time?
No, it was a verbal update, verbal inputs.
Right. Were there any demonstrations given by instructors, as far as you know?
It would be the only demonstrations for the miscellaneous part was on Spithood and the shields.
Right, thank you. And can I ask you also about above that it says baton blocks. The first thing there is positional asphyxia, and that comes under baton blocks.
It's what jumped out at me when I first looked at the checklist here as well, as to why it's positioned there.
Was that part of baton blocks, or was that more of awareness, miscellaneous?
So positional asphyxia was something that was referred to throughout the day, and all the refresher courses that I assessed and I reviewed, you know, it was good to see that positional asphyxia was really, you know, well covered and reinforced. So not just, as I say, why it's sitting in the baton blocks section, I couldn't explain, but positional asphyxia was, I suppose, a golden thread, if you want to call it that would run through, you know, holds and restraints, takedowns, anywhere, any technique that involved a prolonged element of restraint, then positional asphyxia would be referred to. And I witnessed that in, you know, in the refresher courses prior to 2016 programme, the refresher courses that I reviewed and assessed.
And when you use the phrase golden thread, just for others listening, can you explain what you mean by that?
So it was, I suppose, one of the essential elements excuse me, of officer safety training at the time, and it was something that ran through most techniques if there was an element of restraint involved in those techniques, and it was, as I say, reinforced a number of times from my experience.
And we've briefly touched on that. I'm going to come back to positional asphyxia when we go through the manual.
Yep.
Thank you. And it says towards the bottom of that second page, this form is to be completed for every annual requalification course delivered. So was this training checklist, or certainly one like the one we have in front of us, which was referred to by Shaw, was this provided for all the refresher training?
So unless I'm mistaken, this was the training checklist that I designed, and which makes it even worse that positional asphyxia is under baton blocks, but this was the checklist I designed and provided to ensure that consistency and adherence to the programme.
Now, Alistair Shaw says in his inquiry statement he used this in November 2014 when he was teaching the refresher training to Constable Walker.
Yeah.
So do you remember, does that help you in remembering when you prepared this checklist and sent it out to instructors?
Unfortunately, no. As I say, my memory of dates is pretty shambolic. So I think along with the email about adherence to the 2013 manual, this was the first two elements that I produced and you know, towards the step to consistency and standardisation. So whether, I think it was one of the first, let's say the email and this was one of the first steps I took. So it possibly could have been as early as late 2014, yes.
So if Alistair Shaw is referring to having used it in refresher training on the, let me just be absolutely clear, I think it was the 5th of November 2014, it would have been prior to that date that you created this
I know there was a number of checklists in use by various legacy forces. Some of them used their own checklists, but this looks very, very familiar to the one that I produced. So the assumption from that would be that it would be around about that time.
From your best recollection, does this look like the checklist you prepared?
It does, yes.
Thank you. And then on the final page for completion, there's also a part of the checklist to note students who've failed to attend or who've been injured or perhaps have not practiced a certain technique or left halfway through the course?
Yes.
Thank you very much. I'd like to move on now to ask you some questions about, in connection with Acting Police Sergeant Maxwell. And we looked at his scope record earlier this morning before the break. He took refresher training on the 6th of November 2014, and that included OST and first aid spells training. Now there's a signed inquiry statement available to the chair, so evidence from a Ross Crawford, who was an instructor. Do you remember Ross Crawford?
I do, yes.
Right. Is he someone who was one of the instructors you knew or you had
Yes.
contact with? He taught Maxwell on the 6th of November 2014 his refresher training. And his statement also makes it clear, Crawford, that he also taught refresher training to Gibson, Constable Gibson, who received his refresher training on the 4th of March 2015. So Ross Crawford was teaching refresher to Maxwell in the November 2014 and Gibson in the March 2015. Can I ask you to look at the inquiry statement of Ross Crawford, which is SBPI 00391. And again, I would just like to go through some of the things he tells us and tells the chair, some of the descriptions he's given, and see if it accords with your recollection of what was being taught. So you'll see this is Sergeant Ross Crawford's inquiry statement from 15th of August this year. And if we could begin by looking at paragraphs 29 to 31, I think they simply are the paragraphs where he recognises that he taught Scott Maxwell, although I don't think he had a personal recollection, but he checked records in relation to that. Let's move on to paragraph 35, please. And he's talking here about training on arrest and restraint techniques in 2014-2015. And this is during the period that he has taught Maxwell and Gibson. So paragraph 35, he says, I'm asked if I have any recollection of restraint techniques, if restraint techniques were covered in the recertification training in 14-15. Yes, there would be restraint techniques that would be covered in the course, yes. And that's consistent with the checklist that we've looked at. I wasn't aware that you were going to ask me about specific techniques. It's not something I've taught or instructed for a number of years, but from memory, all the techniques that were shown in the OST refresher programme were those that were taught during the full officer safety training programme. Would you agree with that statement? That all the techniques that were shown in the OST refresher programme were those that were taught during the full officer safety training programme?
Again, that's if that's what Ross Crawford is saying that he delivered, then yes, I would agree.
Right. And he says, I think the programme was broken down into empty hand techniques, rigid handcuffing techniques and straight baton techniques. Yes, I recognise those techniques that are on that checklist as being delivered as part of the recertification course. And again, that would accord with what you've told us already.
That's correct,
about
yes.
the checklist. If we could look at paragraph 36. I'm asked if the recertification training in 14-15 covered the risk associated with restraining someone in the prone position. Yes, it did. And again, that accords with what you told us before the break. And then 37. I am asked to what extent did the recertification training in 14-15 cover the risk associated with restraining someone in the prone position. So in terms of positional asphyxia or restraint-related asphyxia, that was one of the 2 specific medical conditions that were covered as part of the Officer Safety Recertification course. The second condition covered was excited delirium. The instructors would highlight the condition of positional asphyxia, what it was, the risk factors which could contribute to the condition, such as any signs or symptoms for officers to recognise, and be prepared to administer first aid. So in relation to that passage, if we can stop there for a moment, could we have it back on the screen perhaps? Would you agree with all of that?
Yes.
Yes. So that is the type of training that was being delivered
Yes.
during that period. Let's move on then to the second part of the paragraph. So yes, that was one of the key considerations that formed a thread, if you like, throughout the whole of the OST programme. Officers were being made aware of and being able to identify the signs and symptoms of positional asphyxia. Now, in fact, you've just used the phrase golden thread, so I can assume from that you agree with what Ross Crawford is saying here.
Yes, I do.
That it was a thread that would come through all of the training.
Yes.
The fact that it can occur when a subject is placed in a position which interferes with their ability to breathe normally, which restricts the diaphragm. And is that the sort of information that was shared with refreshers during that period?
It should have been, yes.
It was highlighted throughout the training that death can occur rapidly as a result of positional asphyxia. So officers were well aware of the condition, what the risk factors were in relation to that, and the signs and symptoms that they should be looking out for when dealing with a subject who is being restrained, as that can obviously increase the risk of positional asphyxia. Again, from Ross Crawford's statement, it appears that he was not giving all the specifics that Alistair Shaw gave. Would that be in line with your recollection of how officers were trained?
Should be trained, yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Let's look at 38 and then 39. I'm referred to paragraph 5 of he'd given a PERC statement, and he'd said, medical conditions and considerations, this is a quote from his PERC statement, are a common thread across the demonstration of all techniques during the course of the training. So I think we've already discussed that you agree with that.
Yes.
And then at 39 he says, I am asked, since I was referring to the probationary training officer safety course manual in this section of my statement, was the topic of medical conditions and considerations to be considered during an arrest or restraint also covered within the refresher training in 2014-2015. Sorry, I didn't read that out very, very well there, but he was referred to the manual. So this is the 2013 manual that we're talking about. And was the topic of medical conditions and considerations to be considered during an arrest or restraint also covered within the refresher training? And that was 2014 and 2015. And he replies, yes, absolutely, yes. And again, in terms of what was being done by Ross Crawford and what you considered to be best practice or good practice, that is the sort of information you would have expected to be shared with refreshers.
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you. So during the officer safety recertification training, positional asphyxia or restraint-related asphyxia and excited delirium were highlighted and discussed. Police officers need to recognise both of those conditions when dealing with a subject. Now, I just want to be clear. As I understood what you said earlier, you weren't expecting refreshers to be able to diagnose a particular condition or recognise symptoms as such, or the cause of those symptoms, but you did expect them to recognise behaviours and manage those behaviours in a particular way.
They were, in the programme, they were taught about signs and symptoms, yes, because that's obviously crucial to how someone would, so the signs and symptoms of what are exhibited by the individual. The causes, no, they weren't expected to to know the cause of the signs and symptoms.
So do you agree with what Ross Crawford is describing here in terms of the type of refresher training that he was delivering at the time?
Yes.
Thank you. And then if we can look at, I think 42. You see here, this is what Crawford says in his statement. I'm asked if recertification training in 1415 covered the dangers of compression of the chest. Again, it's been a significant number of years since I've delivered the recertification training, but positional asphyxia is something that, as a condition, I've been aware of since I joined the police in 2022. And I was interested, sorry, I misread that, 2002. I was interested to read that because that seems to have been something that's been mentioned to officers for a substantial period of time. Does that accord with your recollection?
Yes.
So since 2002, at least, according to Ross Crawford, police officers have been advised about the risks of positional asphyxia
Yes.
during restraint
Yes.
and during prone restraint.
As far as my experience has been, and I joined the police 7 years prior to that, I was made aware during my early years in the police service about positional asphyxia, yes.
Right. So did you join in 1995?
Yes.
And even since then, that's the risk.
If I remember correctly, yes, it was always something that was mentioned.
Right. And did that training, even in those days, also include warning against the risk of lying on someone's back or putting pressure on the chest?
As far as I recall, it was always about, where possible, to have the pressure on the shoulder areas.
Right. There was mention above of the chest. You'll see there dangers of compression of the chest, second line of paragraph 42. We've heard evidence that when doctors talk about a chest, they actually basically mean the whole torso, back and front.
Yes.
Is that the understanding that police officers have?
That's what's contained within their, or was contained and still is within their officer safety training, regardless of whether that person is prone, face down or on their back. Compression to that area, or whether it's through the back or through the front, can have the same effect.
Thank you. Could we look at paragraph 43, please? In terms of the risk factors, Inspector Young mentioned alcohol or drug intoxication if a subject is unable to move from that prone position. Again, things like size, obesity, age, muscle fatigue, the body position being face down, anything that would restrict the diaphragm and affect the person's ability to breathe normally would be considered a risk factor, is my understanding and was always my understanding of what is considered positional or risk-related asphyxia. So he's actually referring to something you've given evidence about. Would you agree with that? I'm not asking if you agree with your own evidence, but would you agree that Ross Crawford's understanding of what's been said about the risk factors is correct?
Yes.
And he goes on to say, so hands restrained behind somebody's back by means of rigid handcuffs would increase the risk of positional asphyxia. So officers should be aware of that when dealing with a subject. So yes, if somebody was prone and there was a restriction placed on somebody's chest, then that would, for me, be a risk factor. And that is something that officers would need to be aware of when dealing with that subject. You'd agree with that comment?
Yes.
And is this something that is shared during refresher training with officers, the need to be alert to these risk factors?
My experience, yes.
And are the officers who are doing this training made aware that they not only need to be aware of the risks, but they need to take action to avoid those risks or mitigate those risks or counter those risks.
Yes, wherever possible, then the officers are taught to counter or mitigate those risks as best they can.
And is it explained to those officers doing training how they can counter or mitigate risks that relate to positional asphyxia?
Yes.
And how are they taught that?
So the first one, which we've already spoken about, is not putting direct pressure either on the chest area or the back area. So the restraint being through the shoulders area. And also then removing that person from that position as soon as possible.
Anything else? We mentioned before the break the possibility of withdrawing or disengaging. Are they taught about that?
They're taught that, whether they were taught that back then, when we introduced the tactical options model, that was one of the options available to officers, and it always has been, depending on the circumstances. So disengagement is obviously a mitigating factor because it would prohibit or prevent the restraint in the first place. Because if you disengage, you may not have to restrain. And by disengaging, you can allow that individual to calm down, the adrenaline to dump, to the chemical cocktail to reduce, which all that would reduce the risk of positional asphyxia if restraint was required.
And I think I mentioned Joanne Caffrey to you before the break, and she gave evidence about disengaging and potentially containing a subject. Was that something else that would be discussed in training as an option?
I really don't think it was particularly an emphasis placed on that back at this time, but it was certainly something that we emphasised, or I emphasised during the new 2016 programme. Obviously the excited delirium, acute behavioural disturbance, contain rather than restrain should be the tactic. If you identify that, obviously it's not always possible to do so. So it's always an option, but whether it's an option in every circumstance has to be taken its own merits, its own threat, its own risk. So while disengagement could be an option, it's not always an option in every circumstance.
And no doubt you'd agree that it'll be for the chair to consider all the circumstances. Yeah, thank you. Can we look at paragraph 44, please? So again, this is Ross Crawford's statement. I am asked if the recertification training in 1415, insofar as it relates to restraint, cover the following topics outlined below. I am asked if it covered the application of weight and pressure to a subject, particularly in the torso area, when restraining someone, and the number of officers involved. Yes, I don't recall specifically if it covered specifically the number of officers involved, but I do recall when we were demonstrating throughout the teaching of restraints, considerations around positional asphyxia were highlighted, particularly around pressure being placed on the subject. And again, does that accord with what you've been telling us today?
Yes.
Thank you. Could we look at paragraph 46, please? And Ross Crawford was asked about the role of a safety officer. He says, I don't recall there being training on the use of a safety officer. I think that's now been brought into the programme. So I'm aware that we do talk about safety officers now, but I don't think that was something that was highlighted in 2014. There was a couple of techniques around a sort of 2 or 3 person team. It was in the manual at the time. Whilst I don't think it was highlighted specifically that one of the officers was a safety officer, it was highlighted that normally between the 2 or the 3 officers dealing with the subject, best practice was to identify an officer that would lead, and it was normally the officer who took control of the head of the suspect that would be identified as the lead officer. So that, in my opinion, would be similar to what's now referred to as a safety officer. We'll pause there for a moment. We had heard evidence at an earlier stage in the inquiry from officers who maybe weren't clear about the term safety officer. And Ross Crawford here seems to be mentioning he's not sure if that term was used and taught as a role, a specific role. But he does mention normally the officer who took control of the head of the suspect would be identified as the lead officer. Can you tell us a little bit more about that training that was given? So in 2014.
So I think what Ross is referring to here is what we used to call 2 or 3 person team, which now I think's referred to as violent prisoner tactics. And that's a specific technique that's used to either to place individuals in a cell who are being violent, resisting. And during that specific technique, we do identify an officer who will control the head. Primarily that's to ensure the safety of the individual, but also aids in the restraint of that individual, because controlling the head can have an effect on the rest of the body. So I think that's what Ross is referring to here. If you're talking about general restraint, i.e. out on the street, in an area, in a house or whatever it may be, where you're trying to either arrest or control a violent individual, there wasn't a reference to safety officers in that circumstances, but there definitely was reference to it in the violent prisoner technique.
In terms of training, refresher training in 2014, was there reference during that training about an officer identified as a lead officer to take control of the head, even if the term safety officer wasn't used?
Yes, but in my experience that was specifically specific to that violent prisoner technique.
Right. So not in connection with a more general
Not
restraint.
in connection with a more general control or restraint technique. We obviously mentioned that you have to be cognisant and aware of breathing, positional asphyxia, but at that time there was no mention of one particular person who should be specifically monitoring the individual for that.
So in the period between 2014 and May 2015, there was no specific training about someone being appointed to that role to monitor a subject's breathing during a restraint?
No, in my experience it was the responsibility of all involved in that. But no, there wasn't any specifically what we would refer to as a safety officer. So no.
When you say it was the responsibility of all, how would the officers involved in a restraint know that it was everybody's responsibility?
Because everybody was trained to be aware of the signs and the symptoms. In terms of what to look for, but I totally understand that if you're controlling a leg, then you're not in a position to monitor that person's breathing. If you're even controlling arms, you may not be around about the head area. So whilst everyone, in my view, should have a responsibility to be aware of the signs and symptoms and monitor as best they can the individuals, then I can understand that it's because no one and even if we did have a safety officer back then, we've still got to remember that it still can't be, if you've only got 3 officers or 2 officers, then it's still particularly difficult. You can't allow just one officer to try and control an individual whilst you're watching their breathing, because then you wouldn't be able to control them.
Right.
So there wasn't anybody who was specifically identified back then.
I'm interested in the idea that everyone should have responsibility, and if we could I could ask maybe some questions about that at the moment. This idea of individual responsibility on each of, obviously depending on the circumstances and what they could see and where they were, but What information, what training was given to officers at that time, 2014, 2015, about having individual responsibility? We've heard evidence that the police are, everyone has different ranks, everyone has different roles. And we may have heard about some officers might feel slightly uncomfortable about pointing something out to someone if they're more senior. In relation to this idea of individual responsibility, maybe seeing something, was there a requirement to do something about that?
There was no, to the best of my recollection, there was never any specific training informing officers that they have individual responsibility during a control and restraint incident. In my view, we have an obligation, we have a duty to preserve life. So therefore I would assume or envisage that it's each individual officer's responsibility to ensure that they meet that duty. But just as you say, it can be extremely difficult at times, because if you are controlling legs, if you're controlling arms, if you're trying to stop yourself from being assaulted, stop others from being assaulted, or stop someone from harming themselves, then that individual responsibility. But for me, it's about having that responsibility of preserving life, and that duty to preserve life is the best of your ability.
Am I right in saying that there are ethical responsibilities on officers? Is the duty to preserve life one of those
Yes.
ethical obligations?
Yes. And a statutory obligation.
I understand.
Yeah.
And is that explained to probationers when they come into the service?
Absolutely.
So would you expect all serving police officers to know that they have an ethical obligation to preserve life?
Yes.
In a situation where an officer can see something that is putting that life at risk, would that be when they should maybe that obligation kicks in, or there is a trigger there for them to take steps to help preserve that life?
In my view, yes.
And could providing that help also include maybe interjecting or offering assistance and saying, perhaps you should not do that, that could be risking life?
I would assert that, yes.
And when we talk about a duty to preserve life, is that both to the public and to subjects within that public, suspects?
Yes, and themselves.
And themselves, and officers. Thank you. Does that individual responsibility vary on officers if they are in a position of seniority or have a supervisory role?
Not in my view. I mean, every officer is a constable, whether it's the chief constable right down to a police constable. So, and in my view, every constable has a duty to preserve life.
And that would include, would that include probationers?
Yes, my view.
And would it include sergeants or acting sergeants?
In my view, yes.
Constables, you've already mentioned. Would it also include more senior officers?
Yes.
So if any officer was in a position to see something happening which placed a life at risk, it would be open to them, regardless of rank, regardless of role, regardless of the status of other officers, to interject and say something.
In my view, absolutely, yes.
And would that be a duty on them to do that if they saw a risk to life?
From myself, yes.
Thank you. Could we move on, please, to paragraph 48? Now, this relates to Ross Crawford's comments about what was covered in the spells training. I understand that's first aid spells training. I'm asked to outline what was covered in the spells training as it relates to the aforementioned question. It was part of your primary survey. Officers would need to undertake a primary survey of the subject identify dangers to them and to the casualty, to members of public, and then assess the casualty's responsiveness. So look for a response from the casualty, and then obviously look to establish if the casualty is in fact responsive, or if they're not responsive, are they breathing? Perhaps we should look at the previous paragraph just to give the context there. So 47, I'm asked if there was training in relation to assessing whether someone was breathing and not breathing during an arrest or restraint. Well, that would be covered in part of the SPELS training in terms of doing your initial assessment of the casualty to establish the casualty's level of responsiveness. So the phrase here that I'm interested in is the breathing or not breathing. And Ross Crawford then goes on to say there's a primary survey which officers carry out. They identify dangers to them, to the casualty, to members of public, and then they assess the casualty's responsiveness. Can you help the Chair understand what training was given to officers in 2014-2015 in the SPELS training or first aid training about checking responsiveness and seeing if the casualty or the subject was breathing or not breathing?
So, as far as I can remember, at that time we were using the acronym Dr. ABC, so which is danger, response, airway, breathing and circulation. And that was the list of priorities that you would check for. First of all, you would check if there was an immediate danger to yourself or to the casualty. So that's things like if there's electrical wires lying there, if there's any other danger that you can see, and then you would go in to see if that subject was responding. So responding to various stimuli. So that would be either voice or pain. So you would speak to the casualty, you'd ask them if they're okay, you identify yourself as a police officer, and you would see if they responded to that. If not, you would then do some sort of movement to see if they responded to that. And then the next one is airway. So is there airway occluded? Is there anything you can do to clear that airway? Are they breathing? So that's where you'd physically check if the chest was up and down, if there was breath signs coming from nose or mouth. And then after that would be circulation. So is there any sort of bleed, whether it be catastrophic or otherwise? So that's what, from my recollection, is what Ross is referring to when he's talking about the primary survey.
Right. And we've heard that acronym before, Dr. ABC. And we've also heard that in terms of response and checking if there's a pain response, there's reference to the Glasgow Coma Scale and checking. Some people may pinch an earlobe, or there would be pressure put on the chest.
Yeah.
Does that accord with your recollection?
Of the training at that time, yes.
But nothing, I think we've heard that it didn't involve slapping a face or anything along those lines.
Not that I remember, no.
No. When you've talked about breathing as being an important part of that acronym, the Dr. ABC, and the reference in Ross Crawford's statement is to breathing or not breathing. We've also heard evidence that in terms of first aid training, there was a breathing and not breathing normally.
Yes.
Now, was that trained in 2014?
I remember it being trained at some point. When it was brought in, I couldn't recall.
And when you say brought in, do you mean brought in terms of general first aid training, or brought in specifically by Police Scotland?
I mean, I don't know. I don't know. I just remember we used to always get taught either breathing or not breathing, and then at some point when I genuinely can't recall. At some point we talked about not breathing normally. Some people referred to it as agonal breathing, that gasping, rasping breathing. Right. When that was brought in, I don't know.
Ross Crawford goes on to talk about this, but I'm wondering if, let's look at the rest of this paragraph and see if that helps in any way. So we'd gone about halfway through. So he's talking about the breathing, not breathing element. And he says, so yeah, during the primary survey, officers would be looking to check for normal breathing, ensuring that there was normal breathing. Again, whilst undertaking the restraint training, I don't recall specifically there being training about how to identify if a casualty is breathing or not breathing, other than highlighting to officers that, that it would be their responsibility to monitor the health of the subject. If at any point they felt that the subject was not breathing, then they should immediately respond to that, whether that's carrying out first aid or contacting an ambulance via the personal radio. So he does mention not breathing normally, but I'm not sure that he's talking about breathing and not breathing normally as the two alternatives. Does that help you in any way recollect whether there was reference to not breathing normally?
Unfortunately, no, sorry.
And so if it's right, as Ross Crawford says, that when he was doing training, if at any point they felt the subject was not breathing, then they should immediately respond to that. Do you think that was the training that was
Yes.
certainly what Ross Crawford was giving in
Yes.
2014-15?
Yes, I would say it's consistent, yes.
But at some point, there was training brought in that you had to look at whether it was breathing, the person was breathing normally.
At some point, yes.
Right. Thank you. Could we look at paragraph 49? It says, I'm asked if I was taught what to do when a person is unresponsive and not breathing, in particular when to commence CPR. This would be covered in part of the SPELS training. So if we identified that a casualty or a subject was then unresponsive or not breathing, CPR should commence immediately. Was there any part of do you agree with that description?
Yes.
Was there any part of the training in 2014 or 15 that described if it appeared the person was breathing, hadn't completely stopped breathing, that CPR should start in any event? Or was the training restricted to if they are not breathing, start CPR?
As far as I recall, it would be if that individual was not breathing, then that would be the indicator to commence CPR. If they were breathing, then, if I remember, the training was what can you do to maintain that breathing. So that would be putting them into the recovery position, making sure their airway was unoccluded, etc.
But it wouldn't include start CPR at that stage?
Not that I remember, no.
Right, thank you. Did it become the position at a later point that when it was the breathing and not breathing normally, that became the distinction? When it was not breathing normally, was the guidance about starting CPR changed for officers?
I couldn't comment on that. The first aid element was not really my area of expertise, sorry.
All right, thank you. Let's move on to paragraph 51, please. And this is about training on positional asphyxia and excited delirium, acute behavioural disturbance in 2014-2015. And he's referred back to paragraph 5 of his PERC statement, page 5 of his PERC statement, which he had prepared at an earlier stage. And he was asked to comment in relation to a recertification checklist. And we've talked about that earlier today. He goes on to say, as it relates to the recertification training in 14-15, I am asked if I could explain briefly what is taught about the correlation between handcuffing a subject and positional asphyxia and excited delirium. So in terms of what was taught in relation to positional asphyxia and excited delirium, these would be medical conditions or implications that were continuously referred to by instructors in my experience throughout the course, in line with all the information that was contained in the OST manual. They would be highlighted as conditions that officers need to be aware of. Information was given around the risk factors, as we've discussed already, and what the signs and symptoms were of both. Taking positional asphyxia first, that subjects should be moved from the prone position or any position in which there's a likelihood that their diaphragm or their ability to breathe normally is restricted. So in terms of handcuffing, it would be highlighted that if a subject was handcuffed to the rear, depending on that individual's shape, build, size and intoxication through alcohol and drugs, then by handcuffing that person to the rear and using handcuffs, that could contribute as a risk factor to increased likelihood of positional asphyxia. Now here there's a reference, and I've asked you about positional asphyxia before, so I have your evidence on that, but here there is a reference to the likelihood that the diaphragm or their ability to breathe normally is restricted. And it would appear that Ross Crawford is talking about a situation where refreshers are trained that there may be restrictions to breathing, and that meant they should be moving the person into a different position.
Yes.
And was it clearly explained during training at that time to refreshers that a person could be in a certain position and have their breathing restricted?
Yes.
So they wouldn't necessarily reach a stage where they were not breathing, but because of that restriction to breathing, they should be moved out of their position.
Yes, because if an individual is in a certain position, then that position itself, along with other factors, can impede their normal ability to breathe, or their ability to breathe normally. So, and we highlight what those risk factors are, and therefore, as far as I've always remembered, and what I experienced, was that you only had a person in that position for as long as you had to.
So although there may not have been that distinction of breathing and not breathing in relation to CPR and that aspect of it, Dr. ABC, in relation to the training given on positional asphyxia, the concept of not breathing normally would have been addressed in training. Is that fair to say?
The risk factors were certainly addressed, yes.
Thank you. Let's look at paragraph 52, please. In terms of excited delirium, again, this was highlighted during the recertification course as being a condition officers need to be aware of. Instructors would highlight what was characterised by the term excited delirium for want of a better expression. The fact that people who are in that state can be dangerous, but also that they may die as a result of that condition, and therefore anyone exhibiting signs or symptoms of excited delirium should be treated as a medical emergency and be assessed at hospital immediately. In addition to that, there was some information given about what the causal factors of that could be, either through drug intoxication, alcohol intoxication, or like a psychiatric illness. I think at that, perhaps we could move the page down. At that time, I don't know if it's still the same, cocaine was one of the most commonly associated illegal drugs that had the potential to induce excited delirium. And if we can go back up the page, please, I'd like to ask you some questions about this. Does this description given by Ross Crawford in his statement accord with your recollection of the understanding at that time?
Yes.
We've heard
Yes.
that things have moved on since 2014
Yes.
In relation to excited delirium. And the chair has a lot of evidence available to him in relation to that. But does this match your understanding of the training that was given, that police officers should be looking at the symptoms, looking for the examples of the behaviours or signs that were happening, but it should be treated as a medical emergency, whatever the cause?
Yes.
Thank you. Can we look at paragraph 53, please? So from an officer safety perspective, that was the things that they should be aware of because there was a risk to them, And again, it was stressed that somebody in that state, that is a medical condition, needs to be assessed by somebody at a hospital. Somebody who's in that condition will need to be monitored when they're restrained at all times. If they're going to be removed or transported, if at all possible, not in the prone position, because as we've already discussed, that would be a risk factor for positional asphyxia, and officers should be aware that if that person's condition were to deteriorate, they would need to be ready to provide first aid to that subject. I'm interested in the sentence in the middle. Somebody who's in that condition will need to be monitored when they're restrained at all times. So that's obviously Ross Crawford's statement about the training. Given what we've been talking about, no safety officer, but perhaps an officer might be at the head monitoring. What training exactly was being given to officers about the need to monitor when they're restrained at all times? This is for someone who they've identified as having the signs of, at that time, it was called excited delirium.
I think this is an example of one of the challenges that we faced back then, in that we told officers the signs and the symptoms, and we told officers what we lacked then was the safe management and being very clear on what the safe management was. So I think we did use expressions like monitored at all times, but we really didn't really define what that should look like or what that should be. I think what Ross is referring to here is that if you suspect someone is in a state of excited delirium, then their physiological signs should be monitored, their breathing, their colour, etc., etc. But in my view, anybody who's restrained should be monitored. So I think that's what he's referring to there without putting words in his mouth.
So, looking back now, if officers were being trained, as Ross Crawford appears to be saying, that they were being trained at refresher training, that they should be monitored at all times. But as you've just said, you weren't giving specific training on how that could be carried out. Do you have any views or comments about the adequacy of that aspect of the training, looking back now?
I mean, one of the reasons why I included the new module or the new elements on acute behavioural disturbance, and we sought external advice to make sure that what we were delivering was accurate, was current, was because we had identified that gap. That it's all very well telling a police officer what to look for, but we're not telling them how to safely manage that. And I don't think that's what we did back then. We didn't talk about contain rather than restrain where possible. We didn't talk about only restrain as a last resort and for the shortest time possible. So we found, and again, I did it myself in years gone by, where your first option, so not your option, but your first action was to get that person physically under control, which if someone is in a state of excited delirium is not always the best approach. So I think in hindsight and in looking back, yes, I think we weren't giving all the information that we should have given back then.
So a lot of information being given at the refresher training about spotting the signs, spotting symptoms, identifying behaviour that might constitute some sort of psychosis or intoxication, mental health issue, excited delirium. But in terms of the training that was being given to officers about dealing with that, they were told it was a medical emergency, and they had information about positional asphyxia and the risks of positional asphyxia in relation to pressure and avoiding putting pressure on the back. But in terms of monitoring that person, the subject, there really wasn't much further training given at that time?
That would be my experience. We weren't specific enough back then about how they should be monitored, what you're looking for. I think we were, I suppose, assuming that that would fall into your doctor ABC.
So was the assumption at that stage in 2014, 2015 that Dr. ABC was sufficient to provide that monitoring technique?
Yes, I think so. In terms of monitoring when restrained, I mean, we were very specific about leg restraints. You know, we told them 15 minutes, loosen their legs, keep an eye out for these, swelling of the legs, reddening of the legs, etc. I don't think we were as prescriptive when we talked about general monitoring. I mean, I think, in my experience, all officers knew about monitoring breathing, changes in colour, cyanosis, etc. But I don't think we were specific when we talked about that, or specific enough.
You've just mentioned leg restraints, and you said you were specific about the timing, 15 minutes, I think you said.
Yeah.
Was that the training that was given in
Yes.
2014? So did that mean the leg restraints could only remain on for 15 minutes?
No, it was a case of every 15 to 30 minutes, I think it was 15 minutes, they should be repositioned, so they should be they should be loosened and replaced. So loosened to let the blood flow again, and then replaced.
I see. And that was trained in 2014?
So that specific timings and that specific management was within the manual.
Right. Thank you. But no specific timings given for restraint itself, or a person being in the prone position for a specific time?
No, and I don't think I have looked extensively. I can't see any academic or scientific evidence that says this is gives an accurate time. For all the research I did, it's for the shortest time possible. That's all I could ever find, and that's discussing with colleagues from down south, discussing with colleagues from across the world, and other police agencies. I couldn't find any evidence of you can only limit it to X amount of time, because the risk factors for everyone are different.
So presumably there's no safe period of time. You can't tell officers if you only do it for 3 minutes it's perfectly
No.
safe.
No.
Because there's so many different factors and circumstances that will have a bearing on the risk
Absolutely.
and the risk to that individual.
And every individual is different.
So there's no safe period that can be identified as far as you know.
As far as my experience is concerned, no.
And is that part of the reason there's an emphasis on doing it for as short a period as possible?
Yes.
Thank you. So let's move on to 54, please, and 55. We'll start with 54. So Ross Crawford talks here about both conditions were discussed and formed an important part of the recertification programme. They weren't taught in a classroom type teach, but they were highlighted by, in my experience, instructors who conveyed the information or refreshed the information that most of the officers who had undertaken that course, it could be a refresher. Because as I say, for as long as I can remember, and I think probably for as long as officer safety training has been taught in Scotland, positional asphyxia and excited delirium have been key considerations as part of the training. Would you agree with Mr. Crawford, Ross Crawford, that they've been key parts, key considerations?
There's definitely been key considerations, but as I say, we lacked about the management of excited delirium.
Right. Look at paragraph 55. He says he's asked about positional asphyxia and excited delirium. They're an important part of the recertification programme in 14-15. Would I have spent a considerable amount of time ensuring that I was communicating this to students that were in attendance, answering any questions and making sure that I covered as much information as possible? Yes, it does. Would that accord with your recollection that instructors teaching positional asphyxia and teaching about these signs and symptoms would be spending a considerable amount of time and would be covering as much information as possible.
Yes.
Thank you. And finally, can I ask you to look at paragraph 57? Ross Crawford says he's been asked if he can expand on an officer's individual responsibility, what that would entail. I mean, for me, that would entail monitoring that individual to ensure that they were okay, that they were breathing, and being able to identify any deterioration in that person's condition, and immediately summoning help and being able to provide first aid to that individual should it be required. So he's talking about what his understanding would be. Do you have any view about whether, in terms of the training that was delivered in 14-15, the other officers who'd had the refresher training would be able to identify or be looking to identify a deterioration in the person's condition? Or are they simply looking for breathing and not breathing?
For me, I'm pretty confident that the vast majority of officers that I trained and I observed other training would be able to identify a deterioration in someone's condition. And again, I think that comes from the monitoring of their responses, their breathing. Again, I say the colour of the colour. So I think in general, in my experience, I'm quite confident to say that the vast majority of officers that I experienced would be able to, yes.
And so there would be some attention to a deterioration in terms of the officers who are restraining a subject or watching a subject, monitoring a subject.
Yes.
So it wouldn't be simply either breathing or not breathing. They would be looking to see any deterioration.
Whether that was actually written down and as part of a policy or part of a manual, I can't recall. But from my experience, yes.
And you're confident that anyone you trained would have been looking for deterioration?
Yes.
And certainly Ross Crawford's talking about, from his perspective, he'd be looking to identify a deterioration.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm conscious of the time and I'm about to move on, so I wonder if that might be...
For lunch, it's 2 o'clock.
Excuse me, could I have your attention, please? It's just to let you aware that we're planning to lock the hearing room over lunch, so please take your belongings with you. We'll be planning to reopen the hearing room at 1:45 in good time for the 2 o'clock